My friends, let me begin with a very simple question. How many wars must the world endure before we finally understand that violence creates only more violence? Today, we are once again confronted with a tragedy that underscores this lesson. Israel's bombing of Sanaa, the capital of Yemen, in response to Houthi strikes. The cycle of retaliation, escalation, and destruction is not simply a story about Yemen and Israel. It is a chapter in a much larger book about the dangerous trajectory of global politics. When we look at this latest development, we must place it in its proper context. Yemen has been under fire for nearly a decade, a country already devastated by poverty, famine, and disease, now enduring yet another round of airstrikes. Israel's bombing of Sanaa, justified by its leaders as retaliation for Houthi drone attacks, is more than just a military maneuver. It represents the deepening entanglement of regional conflicts in the Middle East, conflicts that are increasingly pulling in major powers across the globe. This is not just about Yemen and Israel. It is about Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United States, and beyond. The Houthis, supported in part by Iran, act in defiance of the U.S., Saudi, and Israeli alliance. What we see unfolding is a proxy battlefield where ordinary people in Yemen, already one of the poorest populations in the world, are paying the ultimate price. Let me emphasize something. This is not only a military story, it is an economic story. Wars are profoundly profitable for a very small group of corporations and elites, defense contractors, oil interests, geopolitical strategists. But for workers, for farmers, for the everyday men and women in Yemen, Israel, Gaza, or even here in the United States, war means suffering, instability, and a future stolen from them. And here is the global danger. Each time one of these regional conflicts erupts, the possibility of escalation beyond borders increases. The bombing of Sanaa is not an isolated incident. It carries with it the risk of wider wars. Iran versus Israel, U.S. versus Iran, Saudi Arabia versus Houthis. And from there, the involvement of Russia, China, and other powers. In other words, a local strike can become a global conflict. So I ask again, is this sustainable? How many times must history repeat itself before we draw the obvious conclusion that militarism is not solving problems, but multiplying them? Yemen today, Gaza yesterday, Ukraine the day before. The pattern is clear. The recent bombing of Sanaa, Yemen's capital, by Israel following Houthi strikes represents a significant and troubling escalation in an already volatile region. To understand the gravity of this moment, we must pause and ask a fundamental question. How much more suffering can Yemen endure before the world recognizes the enormity of the crisis? This is not merely another headline in the endless stream of Middle Eastern conflicts. It is a flashpoint that has the potential to push regional tensions into a dangerous new phase. Yemen has been described as the world's worst humanitarian crisis for years, yet the bombardment of Sanaa adds yet another layer of devastation to a country already crippled by famine, poverty, and disease. What we are witnessing is not only a military escalation, but a tragic deepening of human suffering with consequences that extend far beyond Yemen's borders. The context is crucial here. For nearly a decade, Yemen has been locked in a brutal war involving Saudi-led coalitions, Houthi rebels, and shifting international interventions. The Houthis' recent strikes, targeting Israel in solidarity with broader regional struggles, have widened the conflict's scope. Israel's swift and destructive response in Sanaa signals a shift in both geography and intent. What had previously been understood as a civil war contained largely within Yemen is now being internationalized, spilling outward into a broader web of hostilities. Israel's actions are not isolated, they carry symbolic weight, suggesting that any strike against it, no matter where it originates, will invite overwhelming retaliation. The bombing of Yemen therefore stands as both a military tactic and a political message, one that could reverberate throughout the Middle East. For the people of Yemen, the immediate impact is tragically clear. Bombs falling on an already broken city mean more civilian deaths, more destruction of infrastructure, more displacement of families who have nowhere left to run. These are not faceless numbers in an abstract report. These are men, women, and children whose lives are once again being torn apart by forces far beyond their control. This is where we must insert the uncomfortable truth. Yemen is a pawn in larger power struggles. The Houthis' ability to strike Israel is framed by their connection to Iran, and Israel's response is deeply tied to its own geopolitical calculations alongside allies such as the United States. The people who suffer most, however, are Yemenis themselves, people who are already struggling for survival in a country where hunger has become a weapon of war and where international attention too often drifts elsewhere until a new explosion demands headlines. The escalation in Sanaa also reflects the fragility of the region's current balance. Consider how quickly these dynamics can spiral. A drone strike by the Houthis, a bombing raid by Israel, and suddenly Iran, Saudi Arabia, the US, and potentially Russia and China all find themselves at risk of being pulled further into confrontation. The geography of conflict is widening, and with it, the dangers of miscalculation. One could reasonably ask, does this mark the beginning of a larger regional war, one that will not remain confined to Yemen's suffering soil? If history is any guide, such spirals rarely remain contained. Each retaliatory strike not only escalates the conflict militarily, but entrenches political hostilities that become harder and harder to unwind. The tragedy is that none of this is inevitable. Escalation is a choice, one made by leaders who view military might as the only language of power. But this choice has devastating consequences. Yemen, already on its knees, now faces further destabilization from forces beyond its borders. What should have been a war wound slowly healing is instead being torn open with fresh violence. The bombing of Sanaa is a stark reminder of how fragile peace is in the Middle East and how quickly it can be undone. It is also a warning to the world. When conflicts overlap and fuse together, when local wars become interconnected, we approach a threshold where escalation is no longer regional but global. So let us ask again, how much more must Yemen endure? The images of bombed outbuildings, the cries of families searching through rubble, the despair of a people already abandoned by much of the international community. These are not just tragic footnotes in the news cycle. They are alarms ringing louder each day, warning us of the costs of escalation. And the question hangs in the air, will the world listen before it is too late? Have you ever wondered how a conflict that starts in a small country becomes everyone's business? That is precisely what is unfolding in Yemen. Underneath the bombardments and headlines lies a deeper architecture of power. Yemen today is not just a battleground of competing local groups, but a stage for broader regional rivalries where Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and global powers all play their parts. The fighting is no longer local. It is a proxy war, and its stakes are vast. The Houthis, formerly known as Ansar Allah, have long been aligned with Iran, even if that relationship is sometimes portrayed differently by Tehran or external observers. FDD's Long War Journal, TLA3, Al Jazeera, TLA3, Middle East Council on Global Affairs, TLA3, Iran provides the Houthis with political support, military training, and access to weapons technologies, including drones and missile systems. Middle East Council on Global Affairs, TLA2, Al Jazeera, FUD2. This alliance gives Iran a foothold on Yemen's soil, on the southern edge of the Red Sea, and close to strategic shipping routes. It is a way to project power without deploying its own conventional forces in open war. In effect, how this become a regional instrument, enabling Iran to push back against Israel and Gulf Arab powers in ways that are asymmetric, ambiguous, and lower risk to Iran's core territory. But the Houthis are not just passive tools. They are actors in their own right, motivated by their own ideology, grievances, and ambitions. Their alliance with Iran is tactical rather than total subservience. This dynamic means that sometimes their priorities diverge. They will act on solidarity, launching strikes on Israel or targeting vessels in the Red Sea, but they also pursue local goals, controlling territory, managing governance in areas they dominate, and resisting Saudi-led coalitions. Al Jazeera +2 Middle East Council on Global Affairs Proxy 2, that mixture, local autonomy plus external backing, is what makes proxy wars especially dangerous because the actors are partly autonomous, partly beholden to distant powers, and always entangled. To see how these dynamics play out, look at how the Houthis opened a new front by targeting Israel with drones and missiles. Jerusalem Post Play 4 FDD's Long War Journal 24 Council on Foreign Relations Plus. This is not a Yemen-Israel direct war by choice. It is a move shaped by the larger Iran-Israel environment. The Houthis public alignment with Iran gives them both legitimacy and protection, while also giving Iran a channel to escalate tensions without having to personally strike. On the other side, Israel's retaliatory bombing of Sanaa is not only a response to local attacks, but a message to Iran: strike back too hard in Yemen, and Israel's, with allies, may widen the war. In this way, each local skirmish becomes a chess move in a much bigger game. Saudi Arabia and Gulf states also factor deeply into this proxy structure. Historically, Saudi Arabia has viewed Yemen as a buffer zone corresponding to its own national security interests. The Saudi-led coalition intervened actively in Yemen beginning in 2015, viewing Houthi control of the north as unacceptable, especially if backed by Iran. Council on Foreign Relations +1, their bombing campaigns, blockades, and support for anti-Houthi factions have drawn them into Yemen's internal division, even while they attempt to push back against Iranian influence. Thus, Yemen becomes a flashpoint between Sunni Gulf monarchies and Shia Iran, not over Yemen itself solely, but over regional dominance. The proxy war structure raises a dangerous possibility: miscalculations. When external patrons encourage escalation, yet local actors retain agency, the chance of blowback rises sharply. Suppose the Houthis strike Israel again, and Israel responds more aggressively. Iran might feel pressure to retaliate in Syria or Lebanon. Saudi Arabia might open yet another front. Before long, a war that began in Yemen in response to cross-border drone fire becomes a regional conflagration involving multiple states. This is the trap of proxy dynamics. Escalation is amplified, surprises multiply, and the risks of direct confrontation escalate. Moreover, proxy wars distort incentives. Local actors may feel emboldened by backing, believing they have cover or that patron states will protect them. External patrons may push harder, being insulated from immediate backlash. The result is often escalation beyond what any single actor intended. Yemen's population, already battered by war, finds itself in the crossfire of multiple agendas, some external, some internal. When we peel back the layers, the conflict in Yemen is telling us something fundamental. In a system polarized between great powers and regional blocs, small countries often become arenas for proxy battles. And when that happens, the victims are almost always civilians, the people trying simply to live and survive. The proxy war dynamics in Yemen are a warning. When local conflicts merge with regional rivalries, the margin for diplomacy shrinks and the possibility of broader war looms dangerously large. War is often presented to us as a matter of strategy, power, and military might, But behind every headline and every so-called retaliatory strike, there is a hidden arithmetic that cannot be ignored. Who profits from war and who pays the price? The escalation between Israel and the Houthis, with Yemen once again bombarded, makes this question unavoidable. The human cost and the economic cost of this conflict are not abstract concepts. They are lived realities that devastate ordinary people, while a small circle of elites and corporations stand to benefit. The truth is uncomfortable, but it must be faced. For every bomb dropped, someone profits in dollars and someone else pays in blood. Consider Yemen itself. This is a country where millions already live on the brink of starvation, where children are stunted from malnutrition, and where infrastructure has collapsed after nearly a decade of war. When Israel bombs Sanaa in retaliation for Houthi strikes, it does not only hit military sites, it destroys homes, schools, and hospitals. For the average Yemeni, the cost is not measured in the language of geopolitics, but in the very tangible loss of family members, food security, and shelter. The economy of Yemen has been shattered. Jobs vanish, markets collapse, and aid deliveries are disrupted. When warplanes fly, the price is paid by the farmer who cannot bring his crops to market, the mother who cannot find medicine for her child, and the families who must flee their neighborhoods with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Yet at the same time, let us look at another reality that is far less visible but equally powerful. Wars create markets, markets for weapons, for surveillance technologies, for logistics companies, for contractors who rebuild what has been destroyed. In Washington, London, and Tel Aviv, defense corporations watch their stock prices rise every time new escalations occur. The same missiles that devastate a Yemeni neighborhood generate enormous profits for companies producing drones, precision bombs, and fighter jets. It is no accident that in times of war, shares in defense industries spike. Conflict is not only tolerated by elites, it is often profitable for them. And herein lies the moral contradiction. The suffering of Yemenis, Palestinians, or Israelis on the ground becomes the fuel for corporate growth in boardrooms oceans away. The economic cost is not just local to Yemen. It ripples outward through the global system. Every escalation in the Middle East threatens oil supply routes, especially in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a critical choke point for global shipping. Disruptions here drive up the cost of energy worldwide. That means higher gas prices in Europe, higher shipping costs for Asian exporters, and inflationary pressures in the United States. Ordinary workers everywhere, already squeezed by stagnant wages and rising living costs, find themselves paying yet again for wars they did not choose. Meanwhile, speculators and energy corporations use the volatility to their advantage, raking in profits as markets fluctuate. We must also think about the psychological and social costs. War erodes the possibility of normal life. Children in Yemen grow up under the sound of drones and bombings, shaping entire generations accustomed to fear, loss, and instability. That is not only a humanitarian tragedy, it is also an economic one. A society where trauma becomes generational is a society whose future productivity, creativity, and innovation are crippled. What happens to education when schools are bombed? What happens to agriculture when fields are abandoned? These are not abstract questions. They are the daily realities in Yemen. And each day of bombardment deepens the cycle, making recovery harder. The imbalance is striking. War is devastating for the many, but lucrative for the few. This is not only about defense contractors. Politicians and elites often gain as well. Wartime allows governments to justify extraordinary measures, expanded military budgets, repressive security laws, and nationalistic rhetoric that distracts from domestic crisis. Leaders use war to consolidate power while citizens live in fear and scarcity. Once again, the costs and benefits are distributed unequally. Those who decide on war rarely pay its price. Those who bear the cost rarely have a say in the decision. This is why the latest escalation matters far beyond Yemen. The bombing of Sanaa after Houthi strikes is not just a military action, it is a lesson in how war perpetuates itself. Each strike creates more destruction, which creates more contracts for rebuilding, which justifies more weapons orders, which in turn fuels more conflict. The cycle is vicious and it is global. And yet, in the middle of it, the voices of those who suffer most, the Yemenis trapped in famine, the workers worldwide struggling with higher costs, remain unheard. The profits are private, the losses are public, and the longer this imbalance continues, the more dangerous the world becomes for all of us. Each time a missile is launched or a bomb falls in a corner of the Middle East, the world inches closer to a reality we would rather not confront: the possibility that a local war could spiral into a global one. The recent Israeli bombing of Sanaa after Houthi strikes is more than just another tragic episode in Yemen's long and painful war. It is a warning sign, a flashing red light reminding us of how thin the line is between a regional escalation and a worldwide conflict. The stakes could not be higher, because in today's interconnected political and military environment, no war stays contained for long. Yemen has become one of the most fragile links in a chain of conflicts stretching from Gaza to Lebanon, from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea. A Houthi strike on Israel does not simply remain an isolated act of defiance. It resonates in Tehran, in Riyadh, in Washington, and in Moscow. Israel's retaliation in Yemen sends ripples outward, challenging Iran and signaling to other regional players that escalation will be met with force. But here is the dangerous part: what begins as retaliation in one theater can easily trigger counter moves in another. Iran could choose to respond indirectly through allies in Lebanon or Syria. Saudi Arabia, already entangled in Yemen, might feel compelled to reassert its dominance. The United States, bound by alliances and its own strategic calculations, could find itself pulled in deeper. And from there, the door opens wider for Russia or China to step in, not necessarily with bombs, but with diplomatic maneuvers, arms deals, or economic leverage that further polarize the global order. This is not speculation. It is the very nature of modern conflict. We live in an age where war is no longer confined to battlefields, but radiates across borders, trade routes, and financial markets. Think of the Red Sea, where Houthi attacks on shipping already disrupted one of the most vital arteries of global commerce. Each attack sends insurance costs for ships soaring, reroutes global supply chains, and raises prices for consumers thousands of miles away. Escalation there means not only military risk, but economic shockwaves that affect Europe, Asia, and Africa all at once. A missile launched in Yemen can increase food prices in Cairo or gas prices in Berlin. This is the interconnected reality of war in the 21st century, and let us not forget how miscalculations multiply risk. History is full of examples where leaders believed they could control escalation only to unleash conflicts far beyond what they intended. The First World War began with what many thought was a regional crisis in the Balkans, yet it engulfed the globe. Today, the parallels are unsettling. When Israel bombs Sanaa to deter the Houthis, it may intend to send a message, but Iran may interpret it as an opening challenge, Saudi Arabia as a threat to its sphere of influence, and the United States as a test of its credibility. In such a charged atmosphere, even a single misstep, a drone that hits the wrong target, a strike that kills foreign personnel, a misinterpreted military maneuver, could ignite a chain reaction that none of the players fully control. This is why the phrase global war risks is not rhetorical flourish. It is an accurate description of the trajectory we are on. Wars today are networked. They connect through alliances, through trade, through shared ideologies and hatreds. When one part of the network is shocked, the vibrations travel everywhere. The Yemeni conflict is not merely a humanitarian disaster or a regional struggle. It is a potential spark in a room already filled with gasoline. That spark could draw in nuclear armed powers, destabilize energy markets, and deepen the fractures in an already polarized international system. So the question we must ask is not only what Israel hopes to gain from striking Sanaa or what the Houthis seek by hitting Israel. The deeper question is, how long can this cycle of retaliation unfold before it spills into something no one can contain? Each time the world ignores these risks, each time we treat Yemen or Gaza or Syria as distant problems, we blind ourselves to the reality that escalation is not distant at all. It is immediate, it is dangerous, and it is global.